مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ماذا يظن الأميركيون إزاء العالم؟ ما الذي سيقاتل الأميركيون من أجله؟ وما الذي بالتأكيد لن يقاتلوا من أجله؟ في عام 2022 هل هناك سياسة خارجية للحزب الجمهوري؟ هل هناك سياسة خارجية للحزب الديمقراطي؟ هل هناك أفكار رئيسية مشتركة بين الحزبين؟ بغض النظر عن الخلافات السياسية بينهما. لسنوات عديدة اتبعت معظم القادة السياسيين الأميركيين المبادئ القائل بأن السياسة الخارجية توقفت عند حافة الماء. قد نتجادل مع بعضنا البعض محليا، ولكن عندما تألق الأمر بخوض الحرب الباردة قمنا معا وواجهنا العدو كأمة موحدة. ثم سقط جدار برلين وانهار الاتحاد السوفيتي واختفت تلك الوحدة أيضا. منذ ذلك الحين كان الأميركيون يتسارعون حول السياسة الخارجية مثل ما يتسارعون حول أي شيء آخر. الآن مع انتهاء الحرب في أفغانستان وانتهاء المهمة القتالية في العراق سنناقش السياسة الخارجية مع اثنين من أكثر المراسلين السياسيين الجديرين بالتقدير، Ernie Suggs and David Hawkings. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We spend a lot of time on this show talking about politics and policy. This week, let's take our discussion out to the people across America and ask, what do Americans think about the world? And does it matter what Americans think about the world for American foreign policy? Now, Americans are famous for not knowing or even not caring much about the world. Two oceans will do that. But let's dig a bit deeper. And I'm delighted to have Ernie Suggs and David Hawkings with me to help explore these questions. Ernie, let me ask you, when you look and you talk to average people in Atlanta or around Georgia, is there a difference between these days in 2022? Is there a difference between, say, a Democratic foreign policy and a Republican foreign policy?
Well, I mean, I do think, I mean, because the country, we have a difference between Democratic and Republican domestic policy. We have a difference between Democratic and Republican everything, whether or not you root for a sports team. So everything in this country right now is divided along political lines. So when you look at foreign policy, when you look at what the Biden administration is doing in terms of getting back in the Paris, the Paris Accords, rejoining WHO, distributing, COVID medicines across the country, that's starkly different from what the previous president was doing. So you have that line, that dividing line about what the previous president was doing versus what the Democratic president is doing now. And that all seeps down to where we are now. So people that I'm talking to on Peachtree Street or in Loganville or whatever, they have these differences based on their political lines. And if you're a Republican, you think one way. If you're a Democrat, you think another way. We still have people in Georgia calling it the Kung flu. We still have people in Georgia who, Georgia's a state that's turning blue. It's kind of purple right now. We have two Democratic senators. We have a Republican governor. But it's a state that's kind of had a change in political leanings over the last few election cycles. So you have this you have this push and pull here in Georgia about how we address issues, and it all comes from the top. We have, a congresswoman in northern Georgia who you all know, and you've all probably seen her comments about different things and, just how things are. Whereas you have congressmen and senators in Metro Atlanta who think totally different. So in Georgia, overall, you have this kind of wide variety of thought about domestic and foreign policy.
And does that translate easily into foreign policy, David? Or do you see more continuity even in some aspects of foreign policy among the parties?
I think I think among the leaders in Washington, among the the leaders of the two parties, there is less of a split. I mean, I think most Republicans and most Democrats who are leading the country are a little bit more internationalist than most of the voters in either party. Although I think what was just described about the situation in Atlanta, I think is true in Pennsylvania, where I spent a lot of time, in New Jersey, where I spent some time, both in Pennsylvania and especially important swing state in our country, like Georgia is. So remembering that we have the president, Joe Biden, his senator for 36 years, much of that time spent on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He's an interventionist. I would say remembering that most of the other Republicans who ran against Donald Trump 5 years ago had more of an internationalist bent. Trump was more isolationist than most of them. Of course, the war in Afghanistan was a bipartisan thing. Abandonment of the war in Afghanistan had some bipartisan flavor to it. So again, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between elected officials and their partisan breakdown and how the public sees it.
So let me ask you about, ask both of you, but what percentage of Americans do you think are willing to change their lives and accept limitations or restrictions to fight climate change? When you bring it down to that level, is there a party difference on what Americans are willing to do to address this problem? What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, that's a great question because nobody, I think everybody wants to be comfortable. And I think, when you're talking about how we change, how we move around town, when we change how we fly, when we change how we consume products, that's uncomfortable to even the most liberal of us who don't want to change. So it's going to be, I don't know what the percentage is, but I do think that it's always a difficult thing because people see climate change as this broad thing that we don't necessarily see, that our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren have to deal with, that we don't have to deal with right now. So I don't know what the percentage is, but I do have a sense that people don't like to be made uncomfortable, and people don't like to change, and people don't like to do different things. And if that's going to be the case in controlling climate control or or getting a handle on climate, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that all Americans are going to be on board with that.
David, what would you hazard?
I think that's an excellent point that Ernie makes, that we all like to be comfortable. We see, of course, to generalize just a bit, urban America, big cities are generally much more liberal and much more tuned in, perhaps, to climate change than rural America is. I tend to spend most of my time in big cities, and I am astonished by how often you hear people talk about their commitment to the environment. They buy an electric car. They don't buy ground beef anymore because they think that the rearing, the big farming in this country creates too much carbon. And yet they don't recycle. My neighbor is like this, who just doesn't recycle because can't be bothered. A tiny gesture, the tiniest retail gesture that you can do, I guess, as an American, is to separate your bottles and cans and your newspaper from your compostable trash. And yet some people don't do it. Why? Because they don't feel comfortable. So I think there is a disconnect between view and behavior. The huge tradition in American politics of American voters voting against their own self-interest, and essentially favoring things that don't benefit them and opposing things that maybe do benefit them.
And if I can jump in, David, you make a great point. If I can jump in, it's also a matter of knowing stuff. So, David, what you just said about recycling, I recycle religiously. But when you talked about beef and what that means and how the beef industry takes up this large carbon footprint, that's something that I don't even consider when I go shopping or when I eat, when I go pick up a burger. So I don't even consider that as something that has an effect on climate, whereas I'm religiously recycling. So it's kind of one of those things where, it's also a matter of educating people about what it actually is.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to go from recycling and red meat to perhaps the most important foreign policy questions, namely, what are Americans today willing to fight for? around the world. Again, my guests today include Ernie Suggs. Ernie has reported for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, one of America's finest local newspapers, for the past 24 years. A native of Brooklyn, New York, Ernie serves on the advisory board of the Harvard Nieman Fellowships. Also joining us is David Hawkings. David is senior editor of The American Leader, a nonprofit taking on America's biggest systemic problems. He was also the founding editor of the Fulcrum.com and spent 2 decades as senior editor at CQ and Roll Call, 2 must-read news sites covering Capitol Hill. All right, gentlemen, here's the question. We've ended the war in Afghanistan. We are now bringing to an end the combat mission in Iraq. What today are Americans willing to fight for overseas? Ernie, what do you think?
I mean, that's another great question. You know, America, you know, from our earliest founding days, have liked to be over here, liked to be in isolationist. And I think these last 2 wars over the last 20 years have taught us that, you know, we need to understand what we're fighting for. Whether it was World War II, whether it was Vietnam or Korea, it's always daunting and it's always quite telling to tell a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds to go to a foreign country and fight. So I think that as we move forward, having gotten out of Afghanistan, we have to be very selective. We have to be very careful as to what we're going to go over to another country to deal with. You know, we got things raising up now in Asia, in Russia, in Western Europe, Eastern Europe rather, that, you know, could come to a head. And we have to, you know, we have to have some really deep conversations about whether or not we're going to be willing to put boots on the ground for that. And I don't think that the country is willing to do that right now.
So let me focus a little bit more specifically, David. First, Ukraine. If Russia invades Ukraine, a country not in NATO, but certainly with strong Western leanings, is that something Americans are willing to fight for?
No, in a word. I mean, the president himself has essentially taken a military response off the table, at least as we're talking now. So really, no. I don't think the United States see that there will need to be a very, very clear connection, what I call a comma-free connection. In other words, a very simple declarative sentence linking a foreign military intervention to something that directly affects most Americans' lives. Oil would be an example, but I don't think any Vladimir Putin's desire to expand the Russian sphere of influence really would just go right over the heads of the enormous number of Americans. And I want to make sort of one additional point of reminder that when we talk about what are Americans willing to fight for, yes, all Americans would be willing to spend their tax dollars for this, but the number of people actually in uniform in this country is, I believe it's fewer than 2% that have any of families have any connection to somebody in uniform. So it's a tiny percentage of the country. The number of veterans who hold elected office in this country has plummeted in recent years. We recently marked the passing of Robert Dole, longtime Senate Republican leader, nominee for president in 1996. He was the last World War II veteran ever to be nominated for president. We don't have political leaders in this country who served in the military anymore. Not Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, not Barack Obama, not Bill Clinton.
All right. So Ukraine, definitely not. The president made a comment. Perhaps it was an offhand comment, but it triggered some political waves when he referred to a commitment to protect Taiwan. Ernie, China invades Taiwan. Would Americans be willing to come to its defense?
I still don't think so. I just think that, you know, we're at this point now, as David said, that, you know, we are, you know, a lot of these things are kind of, you know, if you ask the average American, when you say, are Americans willing to do this? When you ask the average American about the Ukraine or Taiwan, they have no idea what you're talking about. I think that we live in this world as journalists where we know what's going on, where we're having these discussions, at cocktail parties or in the newsroom or at editorial board meetings about Taiwan and the Ukraine. But average people going to softball games or going to school board meetings have no idea what's going on in Ukraine or Taiwan or understand why these are important. So when you ask the question whether or not we're willing to fight for it, I don't think Taiwan is on the table either as something that Americans are going to rally behind and say we need to go defend Taiwan as desperately as they may need our help.
And so let me ask both of you this. How much of this issue is a function of presidential leadership? Namely, if the president began to educate Americans on the importance of country X or crisis Y, how much of that would change the view of that key middle of America and begin to appreciate this? Is it something baked into our system, or is it a function of presidential leadership? David, what do you think?
That's a fascinating question. It hasn't been tested in a while. I'm one of you, I hope, will correct me if I say this wrong, but I would say the last president to really try and build the case for foreign military intervention was George W. Bush, almost 20 years ago now. And in the end, he based his case that he sold the American public on falsehoods and untruths, mistruths, misinformation at a very minimum. And the country, that only fueled over the long term the country's cynicism about our leadership, about the trustworthiness of the people who were leading us. So I am at first skeptical that a president could use the power of the presidency, the so-called bully pulpit, the podium, the ability to speak directly to the American people. I think he would, any president, man or woman, current president, future president in our lifetime would face a very, very tough sell because of cynicism, not only because of the reasons Ernie and I have been discussing, but because of just general cynicism and distrust in government.
And Ernie, do you concur with that deep-seated sense of cynicism and distrust?
Oh, I agree. And I would even go back to, almost 100 years ago when we look at World War II, when you had a rising tide of fascism, a rising tide of socialism and Nazism that was coming to us, that was getting closer and closer every day. So you had this sense of, whereas the president did a good job, I'm sure, of telling the people, and I think people understood what the stakes were then, and why we needed to enter the war. Of course, we were attacked. But I think it was a different time then where we were more in tune about what was going on in America, what was going on in the world, because it was coming closer to us. What's going on now is so far away, is so distant, is so difficult to understand by the layperson that we just don't want to be involved. We just rather tend to our own affairs.
It's a fascinating comment, because actually back then we didn't get into the war until the war came to us. And
exactly.
Today, the usual comment is today we are so interconnected around the world that with telecommunications and travel, whatever, that what happens around the world affects us in the blink of an eye, except in this conversation, namely on matters of war and peace.
That's fascinating. Although now that I think about it, when I talked about what would Americans be willing to fight for, and I mentioned oil, there are cyber warfare options to our adversaries. I mean, if they took out the power grid, if cyber attack made our access to the internet go down, our access to internet commerce or movies or electricity or the phones
or oil supply,
or the oil supply, that could get the country ticked off pretty quickly.
Yeah, no. I think I don't think there's much debate about when a foreign power attacks American assets. The question really I'm trying to get at is what beyond our own assets, our own people, might Americans be willing to fight for? And I think your observations, both you David, you Ernie, very instructive for our viewers around the Middle East to hear what you think ordinary Americans are and aren't willing to put their lives on the line for. I want to thank you both very much. I apologize, we have to cut this off. This fascinating conversation. Thank you both very much for joining us today on Dakhel, Washington. Something must have made Mother Nature pretty angry, because the tornadoes that ripped through the state of Kentucky were some of the biggest, most powerful, and most lethal in recent history. They cut a path for 250 miles, leaving death, destruction, and devastation in their wake. More than 70 people were killed, hundreds injured, dozens missing. Entire communities were pulverized. For hundreds of thousands of people, life will never be the same. The word tragedy doesn't even begin to describe the enormity of the human loss. Now, this could be an essay about how communities come together to help each other in times of need or distress. This could be an essay about comparing disaster responses between administrations. Or this could be an essay about the impact of climate change on extreme weather phenomena like hurricanes and tornadoes. But it is none of those. Instead, this is an essay about hypocrisy. According to the U.S. Constitution, Congress has to authorize and appropriate all federal expenditure. Indeed, approving a federal budget, including setting taxes and defining where and how much money should be spent on everything from aerospace research to zoo upkeep, that is A to Z, is part of the responsibility of Congress. So too with emergency spending to responding to natural disasters. It is an odd process. Usually disasters are local or regional, whether they are natural disasters like floods or blizzards, or man-made tragedies like terrorist attacks. They occur in specific localities, and the impact is usually restricted to that general area. That normally means the local governor asks the president to declare a certain area, sometimes an entire state, as a disaster zone, making it eligible for emergency relief. It often triggers a request to Congress for special financial aid to pay for relief, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. This is where the problem comes in. There are some lawmakers who stand proudly on the mountain of financial probity and vote against disaster relief time and time again, except when the disaster happens to their state, to their voters. We just saw this hypocrisy in action in Kentucky, where one of its senators and one of its congressmen, loud and famous conservatives, had the gall to ask for public funds to help their constituents after the recent tornadoes, having voted against aid to other states following Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria, disasters that killed scores of people, but disasters that occurred in other states. Shameless hypocrisy was on full display. In my view, we need a better system. I would much prefer to see a fund set up by Congress, which the president could use in emergencies, obviating the need for specific votes that pit one state against another. That would deny these vain legislators the platform for self-serving grandstanding, and it would make sure the aid gets to the people who need it most. In my view, that would be a better system. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حيال الجدل السياسي المتعلق بالسياسة الخارجية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.